The dust kicked up beneath Elizabeth Keller's boots as she stood in the yard, watching the trail where her husband's horse had disappeared over the horizon. The morning sun beat down on her face, already hot though it was barely past dawn. Gone, just like that. 5 years of marriage ended with a hastily scrawled note and the sound of retreating hoofbeats while she slept. Sacramento Valley, California, 1875. The gold rush fever had subsided years ago, but the promise of riches still called to weak men like a siren's song. Men like Thomas, who'd sworn his wandering days were done when he married her. Elizabeth wiped a lone tear from her cheek, then squared her shoulders. The small ranch they'd built together suddenly felt enormous and empty. 20 acres, a modest cabin, 8 cattle, and 2 horses, one of which Thomas had taken. Everything they'd worked for, everything she'd sacrificed for, and he'd abandoned it all for rumors of gold in the Northern Territories. She walked slowly back to the cabin, the note clutched in her hand. "Found my fortune," it read. "Don't wait." As if she were a dog to be commanded to stay or go, Elizabeth crumpled the paper and tossed it into the stove. The flames consumed it quickly, just as her anger consumed the hurt. A knock at the door startled her. Nobody came calling this early, especially not to a place this remote. Elizabeth grabbed the shotgun that hung above the fireplace, another thing Thomas had left behind, thank goodness, and approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "Flynn Sullivan, madam, I've got your cattle." Elizabeth frowned. Her cattle? She opened the door, keeping the shotgun visible. The man on her porch removed his hat, revealing sandy brown hair that curled at the edges. His face was tanned from the sun, with crinkles around blue eyes that suggested he smiled often. He wasn't smiling now, though, as he regarded the gun in her hands. "Your cattle broke through the south fence," he explained, keeping his distance. "I rounded them up before they wandered too far. They're penned outside." Elizabeth lowered the gun slightly. "I don't know you." "Just moved into the old Peterson place about 3 miles south," he said. "Been there about a month now." "Thank you for bringing them back," she said, still wary. "I'll fix the fence today." Flynn Sullivan shifted his weight, then gestured toward the distant horizon. "I saw a rider leaving early this morning, heading north at quite a clip." The comment stung like salt in a fresh wound. "My husband," Elizabeth said, her voice tight. "He's traveling." Flynn's eyes flickered with something understanding, perhaps. "Well, madam, that fence won't hold even a day-old calf. If you'd like, I could help you mend it." Elizabeth's first instinct was to refuse. She'd managed plenty on her own before Thomas, and she'd manage now. But the thought of repairing the entire south fence alone made her shoulders ache already. "I can pay you," she said finally. Flynn placed his hat back on his head. "No need for that. Neighbors help neighbors out here. That's how it works if we're all going to survive." Elizabeth studied him. He seemed genuine enough, and she could certainly use the help. "All right," she said, setting the shotgun aside. "Let me get my tools." As they walked toward the broken fence, Elizabeth felt the weight of her new reality settling on her shoulders. Her husband had left her in the dust, chasing fantasies. Now she was accepting help from a stranger simply to keep her ranch from falling apart on day 1 of his absence. "Been married long?" Flynn asked as they reached the fence line. Elizabeth hesitated, then decided there was no point in hiding what would soon be common knowledge. 5 years. And now he's gone chasing gold. Flynn shook his head as he examined the broken fence posts. Some men don't recognize the real treasure when they have it right in front of them. "What do you mean?" He looked up at her, those blue eyes direct and honest. "He gave up a jewel for stones, madam. Some men are just built that way." Elizabeth felt her cheeks flush and turned away to hide it. She was nobody's jewel. She was just a woman trying to hold on to the life she'd built. "Let's fix this fence," she said, and handed him a hammer. They worked side by side through the morning, replacing broken posts and tightening wire. Flynn was skilled and efficient, and Elizabeth found herself grateful for his help. "You know ranching," she observed as they took a break for water. Flynn nodded. "Grew up on a cattle ranch in Texas. Worked as a trail hand, then foreman. Saved enough to buy my own place eventually." "What brought you to California?" A shadow crossed his face. "Change of scenery, wanted something different." Elizabeth sensed there was more to the story, but she didn't press. Everyone out here had a past they'd rather not discuss. "Well, I appreciate the help," she said, rising to get back to work. "I don't know what I would have done if the cattle had scattered further." You would have managed, Flynn said, his voice certain. You strike me as a woman who manages. The comment warmed something inside her that had gone cold when she'd found Thomas's note. Not that it mattered. She had a ranch to run and no time for feelings of any sort. By midday, the fence was mended stronger than before. Flynn tipped his hat to her as he prepared to leave. If you need anything, Mrs. Keller, I'm just south. The offer stands neighbors helping neighbors. Elizabeth nodded, suddenly reluctant to see him go. The loneliness of the ranch stretched before her like the vast California sky. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Flynn, he corrected with a small smile. Just Flynn. Elizabeth, she replied, and perhaps you might stay for a meal. I've stew that needs eating, and it seems poor thanks to send you home hungry after all your work. His smile widened. I'd be honored, Elizabeth. As they walked back to the cabin, Elizabeth felt a curious lightness in her step. Thomas was gone, and that wound was still raw. But somehow the day didn't seem quite as bleak as it had at dawn. Inside, she served up bowls of rabbit stew, watching as Flynn ate appreciatively. He had good manners for a rancher, she noted. He told her about his small herd, his plans for breeding better stock, the improvements he was making to the Peterson place. And you're managing all this alone, she asked. For now, he said. Might hire help come branding season. What about you? Will you stay here? The question she'd been avoiding all day. I don't know, she admitted. This place was our dream, or so I thought. I'm not sure I can run it alone. You shouldn't have to, Flynn said, his voice gentle but firm. It's not right what he did. No, Elizabeth agreed, it's not. But that doesn't change the fact that he's gone and I'm here with a ranch that needs tending. Flynn set down his spoon. I meant what I said earlier. You seem capable, strong. If you want to keep this place, I believe you can. Elizabeth felt unexpected tears stinging her eyes. Thank you for that. I haven't decided yet what I'll do. No rush, Flynn said easily. Important decisions take time. After the meal, Flynn insisted on helping with the dishes before he left. Standing beside him at the wash basin, Elizabeth was acutely aware of his presence, his height, the breadth of his shoulders, the careful way he handled her mother's china plates. I should check my own herd, he said finally, drying his hands, but I meant it about being nearby if you need anything. Elizabeth walked him to the door. Thank you again for everything. Flynn paused at the threshold, his expression serious. For what it's worth, Elizabeth, any man who would leave all this leave you behind is a fool of the highest order. Before she could respond, he was gone, mounting his horse and riding south toward his own ranch. Elizabeth stood in the doorway long after he disappeared from view, his words echoing in her mind. That night, alone in the cabin she'd shared with Thomas for 5 years, Elizabeth made a decision. She would stay at least long enough to get the ranch in order, to think clearly about her future. She wouldn't be driven from her home by Thomas's betrayal, and if her thoughts drifted occasionally to kind blue eyes and strong, helping hands, well, that was nobody's business but her own. The next few weeks were a test of Elizabeth's resolve and strength. Without Thomas, every task took twice as long. She rose before dawn and worked until dusk, tending cattle, mending fences, and keeping the cabin in order. Her hands grew calloused, her skin bronzed by the sun. Flynn Sullivan appeared every few days, always with some reason returning a stray calf, bringing fresh fish from the creek that ran through his property, offering to help with heavier tasks. Elizabeth found herself looking forward to his visits, planning her days around the possibility of seeing him. You don't have to check on me, she told him one evening as they sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. I know that, Flynn replied. But I like to. Besides, my cabin gets lonely. Elizabeth understood that feeling all too well. Have you never married? He shook his head. Came close once. She decided ranch life wasn't for her. I'm sorry, Flynn shrugged. Don't be, better to know before than after. He glanced at her. Like your husband should have. The mention of Thomas no longer brought the sharp pain it once had. Yes, she agreed, though I'm beginning to think I never really knew him at all. Men like that, they're chasing something they'll never find, Flynn said. My father was the same way. Always looking for the next big strike, the next opportunity, left my mother to raise 3 boys alone. What happened to him? Died in a mine collapse in Colorado. We got word years later. By then, we'd stopped expecting him to come back. Elizabeth studied Flynn's profile in the fading light. You're not like that. He turned to her, his expression serious. No, I'm not. When I commit to something or someone, I stay. The weight of his words hung between them, full of unspoken meaning. Elizabeth felt her heart quicken, and she looked away, suddenly uncertain. It's getting late, she said, rising from her chair. Thank you for the company. Flynn stood as well, respecting her need for distance. Always a pleasure, Elizabeth. I'll check the north pasture fence tomorrow if that's all right. Thought I saw a weak spot when I rode by. You don't have to do that. I know, he smiled. Good night, Elizabeth. She watched him ride away, conflicted feelings swirling within her. Thomas had been gone barely a month. It was too soon to be thinking of another man, wasn't it? And yet, Flynn Sullivan had become a constant in her life. A steady presence she could rely on when everything else felt uncertain. The next morning, Elizabeth was milking her cow when she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses, not just one. She set aside the milk pail and went to see who was coming. 3 riders appeared, none of them Flynn. Elizabeth recognized one as Silas Johnson, who owned the general store in the small town 15 miles away. The other 2 were strangers. Mrs. Keller, Silas called as they approached. Got a moment to talk? Elizabeth wiped her hands on her apron. Of course, Mr. Johnson. Would you like to come inside? Silas dismounted, but the other 2 men remained on their horses. This is Mr. Harrison and Mr. Wells, Silas said. They're interested in buying property in the area. Elizabeth felt a chill despite the warm morning. My property isn't for sale, Mr. Johnson. Now, Mrs. Keller, Silas said, his tone placating, we all know your situation has changed. These gentlemen are prepared to make a very generous offer. Enough for you to start fresh somewhere more suitable for a woman alone. Anger flared in Elizabeth's chest. My situation, as you put it, is my own concern, and I'm managing quite well, thank you. The taller of the 2 strangers, Harrison, spoke up. We understand your husband has abandoned the property, madam. A place this size requires a man's touch. We're offering fair market value plus 20%. The property isn't for sale, Elizabeth repeated firmly. At any price. Harrison exchanged a look with his companion. Perhaps you should take some time to consider our offer. It won't remain open indefinitely. Is that a threat, Mr. Harrison? Not at all, Silas interjected quickly. Just good business sense. Land this good won't stay available for long. Elizabeth crossed her arms. Then it's fortunate it's not available at all. Good day, gentlemen. The men didn't move. Harrison leaned forward in his saddle. Mrs. Keller, I don't think you understand. The railroad is coming through. This land will be worth 10 times what we're offering once the tracks are laid. So that was it. They thought they could swindle her because she was alone, take advantage of her supposed vulnerability to acquire land that would soon be valuable. I understand perfectly, Elizabeth said coldly, and my answer remains the same. Now, unless you'd like to discuss the weather, I have work to do, Silas sighed. Be reasonable, Elizabeth. You can't run this place by yourself. I believe the lady said she's not selling. The new voice came from behind the men. Flynn sat atop his horse, his expression calm but his eyes hard as steel. Elizabeth hadn't heard him approach. Harrison turned in his saddle. This is a private business discussion. Doesn't look like business to me, Flynn said. Looks like 3 men harassing a woman on her own property. We're simply making an offer, Wells said, speaking for the first time, and she's declined, Flynn replied. Repeatedly from what I heard. Silas cleared his throat. Now, Flynn, we're just looking out for Mrs. Keller's interests. A woman alone is still the owner of this land, Flynn finished for him, and free to do with it as she pleases. Elizabeth stepped forward. Thank you for your concern, gentlemen, but as both Mr. Sullivan and I have made clear, I'm not interested in selling. Not today, not tomorrow. Harrison's face darkened. You might reconsider when things start getting difficult around here. Flynn moved his horse closer. That sounded an awful lot like a threat, Harrison. Take it however you like, Sullivan. Harrison pulled his horse around. Come on, boys. The ladies made her choice for now. The 3 men rode away, dust rising behind them. Elizabeth watched until they disappeared, then turned to Flynn. Thank you, she said, though I could have handled them. I know you could have, Flynn replied. But I was riding by anyway, and 3 against 1 didn't seem sporting. Elizabeth smiled despite her lingering anger. How much of that did you hear? Enough. Flynn dismounted, leading his horse to the water trough. They're right about one thing, the railroad is coming, land prices will rise. I'm not selling, Flynn nodded. I figured as much. Just thought you should know they weren't lying about that part. Elizabeth looked around at her land, the rolling pastures, the small orchard Thomas had planted there first year, the creek that provided fresh water even in the driest summers. This was home, regardless of who had left or stayed. They'll be back, she said. Probably, Flynn agreed. But next time you'll be prepared. Elizabeth gave him a questioning look. I know some people in town, Flynn explained. I'll ask around about Harrison and Wells, find out what they're really after. In the meantime, might be good to have some extra eyes on your property. I can't ask you to do that. Flynn's expression softened. You didn't ask, I offered, that's different. Later that evening, after Flynn had gone, Elizabeth sat at her small desk and wrote a letter to her sister in St. Louis. She explained Thomas's departure, the ranch situation, and the men who'd come making offers. She described Flynn's help and friendship, careful to keep her tone neutral despite the warmth that filled her whenever she thought of him. She needed her sister's clear-eyed advice. Emma had always been the practical one, the voice of reason. Elizabeth sealed the letter, knowing it would be weeks before she received a reply. Until then, she would have to trust her own judgment, and her judgment told her that Flynn Sullivan was a good man, perhaps the best man she'd ever known. The next morning, Elizabeth decided to ride into town for supplies and to post her letter. The small settlement of Riverside was hardly more than a wide spot in the road, a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and a handful of houses clustered around a dusty main street. But it was the closest place to get necessities and pick up mail. As she tied her horse outside the general store, Elizabeth noticed several men watching her with undisguised interest. News traveled fast in small communities. Everyone likely knew by now that Thomas had abandoned her. She held her head high as she entered the store, nodding politely to Mrs. Johnson behind the counter. Elizabeth, the older woman said warmly, "Good to see you. How are you holding up?" "I'm well, thank you," Elizabeth replied, determined not to be the object of pity. Just needing a few supplies and to post a letter, Mrs. Johnson's expression was sympathetic. "I want you to know I don't agree with what Silas and those men did yesterday, coming to your place like that." Elizabeth appreciated the woman's honesty. "Thank you for saying so. Those men Harrison and Wells, they've been buying up land all around the valley. Some say they're working for the railroad, others think they're speculators." Mrs. Johnson leaned closer. "Either way, they don't take no for an answer easily." "I'm not concerned," Elizabeth said, though the warning did trouble her. "Flynn Sullivan's been asking about them this morning," Mrs. Johnson continued, watching Elizabeth's reaction closely. "He seems quite concerned for your welfare." Elizabeth focused on her shopping list. "Mr. Sullivan has been a good neighbor." "Just a neighbor?" Mrs. Johnson raised an eyebrow. "Yes," Elizabeth said firmly. "Now I need flour, sugar, coffee, and some nails." As Mrs. Johnson gathered the items, the store door opened and Flynn himself walked in. He looked surprised to see Elizabeth. "Elizabeth," he said, removing his hat, "didn't expect to see you in town today." "Just picking up a few things," she replied, acutely aware of Mrs. Johnson's interested gaze. "And you?" "Same," he said, "and checking on a few matters." Elizabeth knew he meant Harrison and Wells. "Find out anything useful?" Flynn glanced at Mrs. Johnson, who was making no effort to hide her eavesdropping. "Perhaps we could discuss it over lunch. The hotel serves a decent meal." The invitation was innocent enough, but Elizabeth hesitated. Being seen dining with Flynn would only fuel gossip. Still, she wanted to hear what he'd learned. "Thank you, that would be nice," she said finally. "Let people talk." She had nothing to be ashamed of. After paying for her supplies and posting her letter, Elizabeth walked with Flynn to the small hotel at the end of the street. They drew curious glances, which she pretended not to notice. The hotel dining room was nearly empty this early in the afternoon. They took a table by the window, and a tired-looking waitress brought them coffee. "So," Elizabeth said once they were alone, "what did you discover?" Flynn leaned forward, keeping his voice low. "Harrison and Wells have been buying land all along the proposed railroad route. They're not railroad men themselves, they're speculators. They buy the land cheap, then sell it to the railroad at a massive profit. And they want my land because your ranch sits at a perfect spot for a water stop," Flynn explained. "Flat terrain, good water supply from your creek. They'll build a water tower there, maybe eventually a small station. The value will triple overnight." Elizabeth considered this information. I still don't want to sell. I know. Flynn's blue eyes held hers. And you shouldn't have to. But these men play rough, Elizabeth. They've forced other landowners out mysterious cattle deaths, barns burning, fences cut. A chill ran through her. You think they'd do that to me? I think they might try, Flynn said grimly. Which is why I've been asking around about them, letting it be known that you have friends in the area. Friends, Elizabeth repeated softly. Flynn reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers briefly before withdrawing. Yes, friends, you're not alone in this, Elizabeth. The touch, fleeting as it was, sent warmth through her entire body. Elizabeth looked down at her coffee, struggling to maintain her composure. Thank you, she managed finally, for everything you've done. You'd do the same for any neighbor, Flynn said. Though his tone suggested he knew it was more than that, they ate a simple meal of beef stew and biscuits, their conversation turning to lighter topics: the weather, the condition of the pastures, Flynn's plans for his ranch. By the time they finished, Elizabeth felt more relaxed than she had in weeks. As they stepped outside, Flynn touched her elbow lightly. I have one more errand to run. Would you mind waiting? I'd feel better riding back with you given what we discussed. Elizabeth nodded, touched by his concern. I'll wait by the horses. She stood in the shade of the general store awning, watching the dusty street. A group of men emerged from the saloon across the way, laughing loudly. Among them were Harrison and Wells. Elizabeth turned away, hoping they wouldn't notice her, but luck wasn't with her. Well, if it isn't the stubborn widow, Harrison called, crossing the street toward her. His companions followed, including Wells and two men she didn't recognize. I'm not a widow, Mr. Harrison, Elizabeth said coldly, and I'd appreciate it if you'd leave me be. Harrison smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just being friendly, Mrs. Keller. Have you reconsidered our offer? I have not. Wells stepped forward. That's unfortunate, very unfortunate. The implied threat hung in the air between them. Elizabeth stood her ground, though her heart was racing. Is there a problem here? Flynn's voice came from behind her as he exited the store, packages in hand. Harrison's smile widened. No problem at all, Sullivan, just catching up with Mrs. Keller. Funny, Flynn said, moving to stand beside Elizabeth. She doesn't look like she wants to be caught up with. You seem mighty protective of another man's wife, Wells commented, his tone insinuating. Flynn's expression didn't change, but Elizabeth saw his jaw tighten. I'm protective of people being harassed, especially neighbors. We were just leaving, Elizabeth said, turning to her horse. Flynn helped her mount, then secured her packages before mounting his own horse. Remember what I said, Mrs. Keller, Harrison called as they prepared to ride away. Unfortunate things happen to stubborn people. Flynn reined his horse around to face the men. And remember this, Harrison, Mrs. Keller isn't alone out here. Any trouble at her ranch, any at all, and I'll know exactly who's responsible. Without waiting for a response, Flynn turned his horse and rode alongside Elizabeth out of town. They were silent until the settlement was well behind them. I'm sorry about that, Flynn said finally. It's not your fault. No, but I'm sorry you have to deal with men like that. He looked troubled. Elizabeth, I think you should consider staying at my place for a few days. She jerked her head up in surprise. What? Not. Flynn cleared his throat, a flush creeping up his neck. I meant the guest room. I'm worried about what Harrison might do, and my place is more defensible. I have a ranch hand staying in the bunkhouse as well. Elizabeth considered his offer. The threat felt real, and the thought of staying alone at her ranch tonight was suddenly less appealing. What about my animals? She asked. We can bring your milk cow and horse, Flynn said. The cattle can stay in the south pasture. They're close enough to my property that my hand and I can keep an eye on them. It made sense, but Elizabeth hesitated. Staying at Flynn's ranch, even in a guest room, would set tongues wagging even more than their lunch together had. Just for a few days, Flynn added, sensing her reluctance, until we can figure out how to handle Harrison and Wells. All right, Elizabeth agreed finally, but just for a few days. They returned to her ranch to gather her things and tend to the animals. As Elizabeth packed a small bag with clothes and essentials, she felt a strange mixture of nervousness and anticipation. It was the sensible choice given the circumstances, she told herself. Nothing more. Flynn's ranch was similar to hers in size but better established. The main house was larger, with a wide porch wrapped around three sides. A bunkhouse, barn, and several corrals completed the compound. It looked well-maintained and prosperous. A young man emerged from the barn as they rode in. "Everything all right, boss?" he called. "Fine, Jake," Flynn replied. "Mrs. Keller will be staying with us for a few days. There's been some trouble in town." Jake nodded, taking the reins of their horses. "The guest room's all made up. I'll see to the animals." Inside, Flynn showed Elizabeth to a comfortable room at the back of the house. It was simply furnished but clean and welcoming, with a window overlooking the pastures. "Make yourself at home," Flynn said. "I'll get dinner started." Left alone, Elizabeth sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's events. She'd gone from being a married woman with a husband and a secure future to being alone, threatened, and now staying in another man's home, all in the span of a few weeks. And yet, as she looked around the peaceful room, listened to Flynn moving about in the kitchen, she felt safer than she had since Thomas left. Perhaps even before. Dinner was a simple affair: roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh bread that Flynn had apparently baked himself. Jake joined them, and the conversation flowed easily, focusing on ranch matters and carefully avoiding any mention of Harrison and Wells. After the meal, Jake excused himself to check the livestock, leaving Elizabeth and Flynn alone. They moved to the porch, where the evening breeze offered relief from the day's heat. "Thank you for dinner," Elizabeth said, settling into a rocking chair. "I didn't know you could cook," Flynn smiled. "Bachelor living teaches you a few things, though I'm sure it doesn't compare to your cooking." "It was wonderful," she assured him. "Better than anything Thomas ever made on the rare occasions he cooked." The mention of her husband's name brought a momentary awkwardness. Flynn studied her face in the fading light. "Do you miss him?" he asked softly. Elizabeth considered the question, wanting to be honest. "I miss having a partner," she said finally. "Someone to share the work, the decisions, but Thomas himself." She shook her head. "I'm beginning to realize what we had wasn't what I thought it was." Flynn nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Marriage should be a true partnership, equal commitment on both sides." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed. "I thought we had that, but when gold called louder than I did, I realized the truth." "His loss," Flynn said simply. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, the only sounds the creak of the rocking chairs and the chorus of night insects. Elizabeth felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. "Flynn," she said eventually, "why did you really come to California? You never quite explained." He was quiet for so long that Elizabeth thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was subdued. "I had a brother," he said. "Younger than me by 4 years. We ran a ranch together in Texas after our father left. Did well too, but Frank, he was like our father in some ways, restless. When he heard about opportunities out west, nothing could keep him." Flynn paused. "We argued, said things we couldn't take back. He left anyway." "What happened?" "Got word a year later that he died in a bar fight in Sacramento. By the time I got here, he was long buried." Flynn's hands gripped the arms of the rocking chair. "I couldn't save him, couldn't even say goodbye properly, so I stayed, bought land. Thought maybe I could understand what drew him here." "I'm so sorry," Elizabeth said, her heart aching for him. Flynn turned to her, his expression softening. "When I saw you that first day, standing there with your shotgun after your husband had just left, it reminded me of Frank. Another person abandoned by someone who should have stayed. I couldn't help him, but maybe I could help you." "Is that all it was?" Elizabeth asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Just helping a neighbor because of your brother." Flynn held her gaze. "No," he said quietly. "That's not all it was." The admission hung between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest. "It's getting late," she said, rising from her chair. "I should turn in." Flynn stood as well. "Of course, sleep well, Elizabeth." She paused at the door. "Flynn, thank you for telling me about your brother, for trusting me with that." "Thank you for listening," he replied. "Good night." In the guest room, Elizabeth changed into her nightgown and climbed into bed, but sleep eluded her. Her mind kept returning to Flynn's face as he told her about his brother. The honesty in his eyes when he admitted his feelings went beyond neighborly concern and her own feelings. Elizabeth pressed her hands to her flushed cheeks. It was too soon, surely. Thomas had only been gone a month, but their marriage had been dying long before he physically left, she realized. His dreams had always been elsewhere, whereas Flynn was steady, present, reliable. And when he looked at her, Elizabeth felt truly seen for perhaps the first time in her life. Sleep finally claimed her, and she dreamed of blue eyes and gentle hands. Elizabeth woke to the sound of voices raised, angry voices. She dressed quickly and hurried outside to find Flynn and Jake confronting Harrison and 3 other men on horseback. "What's going on?" she asked, coming to stand beside Flynn. Harrison smiled that cold smile that never reached his eyes. "Just delivering some news, Mrs. Keller. Seems your husband has gotten himself into some trouble up north, owes quite a bit of money to some dangerous people." Elizabeth frowned. "What does that have to do with me?" "Well," Harrison said, examining his gloves, "these debts are against your property. As his wife, you're liable. Unless, of course, you sell the property to cover what's owed." Flynn stepped forward. "That's ridiculous. She can't be held responsible for debts he incurred after abandoning the property." "The law says differently," one of Harrison's companions said. "As long as they're still married, her property is his property." Elizabeth felt sick. Could this be true? Could Thomas have somehow mortgaged or borrowed against their ranch without her knowledge? "I want to see proof," she said firmly. "Documentation of these supposed debts." Harrison nodded to one of his men, who produced an official-looking document. "This is a lien against the Keller property filed yesterday in Sacramento. Your husband borrowed $5,000 from my associates, using the ranch as collateral." Flynn took the paper, examining it closely. "This isn't legal. She never signed it." "Doesn't have to," Harrison said. "Husband's signature is enough in this territory." Elizabeth felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd built, could be taken away because of Thomas's recklessness. "How much time do I have?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. 30 days to pay in full," Harrison replied, "or we take possession. Of course, our offer to buy still stands. We'd pay enough to cover the debt and leave you something to start fresh." Flynn handed the document back. "We'll need to verify this is legitimate." "By all means," Harrison said, sounding confident. "Check with the county clerk. It's all above board." He tipped his hat to Elizabeth. "Think about our offer, Mrs. Keller. It's the easiest way out of this mess your husband left you in." The men rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and stunned silence behind them. "Can they really do this?" Elizabeth asked, her voice small. Flynn's expression was grim. "I don't know, but we're going to find out." Jake offered to stay and watch both properties while Flynn and Elizabeth rode to Sacramento to investigate the claim. It was a full day's ride, but they pushed hard, arriving as evening fell. They found lodging at a modest hotel, taking separate rooms. "We'll go to the county clerk first thing in the morning," Flynn said as they parted in the hallway. Elizabeth barely slept, her mind racing with worry. If the debt was real, if Thomas had truly done this to her, she would lose everything. The unfairness of it burned like acid in her stomach. At dawn, they made their way to the county offices. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, listened to their inquiry with mild interest. "Keller property, you say? Let me check the records." He disappeared into a back room, returning with a large ledger. "Yes, here it is. Lien filed 3 days ago by Harrison Holdings against the property of Thomas and Elizabeth Keller for the amount of $5,000. "May I see the loan document?" Flynn asked. The clerk adjusted his spectacles. "That would be held by the lender, sir. We only record the lien itself." "Is there any way to contest this?" Elizabeth asked. "I never agreed to this loan. My husband left the property a month ago." The clerk looked sympathetic. "I'm afraid that without a legal separation or divorce, your husband's debts are yours as well, madam, unless you can prove fraud." "And how would we do that?" Flynn pressed. "You'd need to prove he forged documents or misrepresented himself," the clerk explained. "Do you have reason to believe that's the case?" Elizabeth thought of Thomas, of his desperation for gold, his willingness to abandon everything they'd built together. "Yes," she said slowly. "I think I do." They spent the rest of the day visiting law offices, seeking advice. The consensus was discouraging. Without clear evidence of fraud, Elizabeth would be held responsible for Thomas's debts. "There's one more person we should talk to," Flynn said as they left the third lawyer's office. "A friend of mine works for the railroad. He might know something about Harrison's operation." Flynn's friend, a surveyor named Daniel Cooper, met them at a small cafe near the railroad offices. He listened to their story with growing concern. "Harrison's been causing trouble all along the proposed route. Daniel confirmed. Buying land, pressuring people to sell, but this is a new tactic, even for him. Do you think the debt is real? Elizabeth asked. Daniel shrugged. Hard to say. Harrison has connections with some shady lenders. But it's also possible he's created this debt out of thin air, betting you won't have the resources to fight it. And the railroad? Flynn asked. Are they working with Harrison? Officially, no, Daniel said. The railroad prefers to deal directly with landowners. But Harrison gets the job done, and they don't ask too many questions about his methods. Elizabeth felt a flicker of hope. So if we could prove Harrison fabricated this debt, you might have a case, Daniel agreed, but you'd need solid evidence, and you'd need to move quickly. They rode back to Riverside the next day, both lost in thought. Elizabeth broke the silence as they neared home. Thank you, she said, for coming with me, for helping me fight this. Flynn glanced at her, his expression gentle. I told you before, you're not alone in this. Why? Elizabeth asked, the question that had been on her mind for weeks finally finding voice. Why do you care so much what happens to me, to my ranch? Flynn reined his horse to a stop, turning to face her fully. Do you really not know, Elizabeth? Her heart pounded. I want to hear you say it. He held her gaze, his blue eyes sincere. Because from the moment I saw you standing on your porch that first day, I knew you were special, strong, determined, beautiful, the kind of woman a man would be a fool to leave. He paused. The kind of woman I've been looking for my whole life. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. Flynn, I know it's too soon, he continued quickly. I know you're still married, still dealing with all of this. I'm not asking for anything. I just want you to know why I'm here, why I'll keep being here. Tears stung Elizabeth's eyes. I don't know what to say. Flynn smiled gently. You don't have to say anything. Let's just get home and figure out how to fight Harrison. They rode the rest of the way in a silence that felt different, charged with possibility rather than anxiety. When they reached Flynn's ranch, Jake met them with troubling news. Someone cut the south fence on Mrs. Keller's property, he reported. Cattle scattered. I rounded up most of them, but a few are still missing. Elizabeth exchanged a look with Flynn. Harrison wasn't wasting any time. There's more, Jake added. A man came by looking for Mrs. Keller, said he's her husband. Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. Thomas is here, Jake nodded. Showed up yesterday, said he'd be waiting at your ranch when you got back. Flynn's expression darkened. Did he say what he wanted? No, but he looked rough, like he'd been traveling hard. Elizabeth's mind raced. Thomas, back after a month's absence. Was it coincidence that he returned just as Harrison filed a lien against their property? Or was there more to it? I need to see him, she decided. Find out what's going on. Flynn looked concerned. Not alone. Flynn, he's right, Jake interjected. Those men who were here with Harrison, they've been watching both properties. Something doesn't feel right about any of this. Elizabeth knew they were right. If Thomas had truly borrowed money using their ranch as collateral, confronting him alone would be foolish. All right, she conceded. We'll go together. As they rode toward Elizabeth's ranch, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape. The cabin looked peaceful in the golden light, smoke rising from the chimney. Thomas was clearly making himself at home. They dismounted outside, and Elizabeth steeled herself for the confrontation. Flynn stayed close behind her as she approached the door. Before she could knock, it swung open. Thomas stood there, thinner than when he'd left, his face weathered by sun and hardship. His eyes widened at the sight of Flynn. Lizzie, he said, using the nickname she'd always disliked. You're back. It's my home, Elizabeth replied coolly. What are you doing here, Thomas? He stepped back, allowing them to enter. Can't a man come home to his wife? The cabin was untidy, with Thomas's belongings scattered about. A bottle of whiskey sat half empty on the table. You gave up that right when you left without saying goodbye, Elizabeth said. Why are you really here? Thomas's gaze flickered between her and Flynn. Who's your friend? Flynn Sullivan. Flynn introduced himself, his tone neutral but his posture alert. I own the ranch to the south, and you're keeping company with my wife. Thomas's voice had an edge to it. Elizabeth cut in before Flynn could respond. We're here about the lien, Thomas, the $5,000 you supposedly borrowed against our ranch. Thomas's expression shifted, a flash of something guilt, fear crossing his face before he composed himself. That had some bad luck up north. Needed capital to invest in a sure thing. So you mortgaged our home without telling me. Elizabeth's anger rose. You abandoned this ranch, abandoned me, and then put everything at risk, Thomas shrugged, taking a swig from the whiskey bottle. It's still my property, Lizzie. Man's got a right to do what he wants with his own land. Flynn stepped forward. It's Elizabeth's land too. She's the one who's been working it, maintaining it. And who are you to interfere in matters between a man and his wife? Thomas challenged, drawing himself up. A friend, Flynn said simply. Someone who cares what happens to Elizabeth, Thomas snorted. I see how it is. I'm gone a few weeks and you find yourself a replacement already. The accusation stung, but Elizabeth refused to be baited. The lien gives us 30 days to pay, Thomas. Do you have the money? He looked away. Not yet, but I will. Got a lead on something big. More gold, Elizabeth asked bitterly. That's what took you away in the first place. This is different, Thomas insisted. This is a sure thing. Flynn crossed his arms. Does this sure thing have anything to do with Harrison? Thomas's head jerked up. What do you know about Harrison? We know he's been trying to buy Elizabeth's land, Flynn said. We know he's the one who filed the lien. What we don't know is whether you're working with him. Working with, Thomas sputtered. That's ridiculous. The man's a shark. He caught me in a weak moment, offered a loan when I needed it. Elizabeth studied her husband, trying to see past the bluster to the truth. Did you actually receive $5,000 from him? Thomas hesitated just a fraction too long. Of course I did. You're lying, Elizabeth said, certainty in her voice. Harrison created this debt to force me to sell, and you're helping him. That's crazy, Thomas protested, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. Flynn moved closer to Elizabeth. How much did he pay you, Keller? What's your cut when he gets the land? Thomas's face flushed with anger. You don't understand. I was in trouble up north. Bad trouble. Harrison offered a way out. By sacrificing our home, Elizabeth's voice rose, by lying to me, betraying me again. It's just land, Lizzie, Thomas said, his tone wheedling now. We can start over somewhere else. Harrison's paying good money. Elizabeth felt a strange calm settle over her. This man, this stranger, had once been the center of her world. Now she could see him clearly for what he was. Selfish, weak, willing to sacrifice anything and anyone for his own benefit. Get out, she said quietly. Thomas blinked. What? Get out of my home, Elizabeth repeated, her voice stronger. You lost the right to be here when you abandoned it. When you betrayed it. Now wait a minute, Thomas began, his face darkening. This is still my property and you're still my wife. Flynn stepped between them. She asked you to leave. Thomas's hand moved toward his hip, where Elizabeth knew he kept a small revolver. Flynn tensed, ready for trouble. Don't, Elizabeth warned. Just go, Thomas, we'll sort this out legally. For a moment she thought he might refuse, might escalate the situation to violence. Then abruptly the fight seemed to go out of him. Fine, he muttered, grabbing his coat. But this isn't over, Lizzie. That lien is legal and Harrison will have this land one way or another. We'll see about that, Flynn said quietly. Thomas pushed past them, pausing at the door. You think you've got it all figured out, don't you, both of you, but Harrison's not a man to cross. And neither am I. With that final threat, he was gone, the door slamming behind him. Elizabeth listened to the sound of his horse galloping away, a mixture of relief and apprehension washing over her. Are you all right? Flynn asked, his voice gentle. Elizabeth nodded, moving to sit at the table. I don't know him anymore. Maybe I never did. Flynn sat across from her. I think you're right about the debt. Harrison probably paid Thomas to create a false lien. But how do we prove it? Elizabeth asked, frustration creeping into her voice. The lien is filed legally, without evidence of fraud. We'll find evidence, Flynn assured her. Thomas doesn't strike me as the careful type. He'll have made mistakes. Elizabeth looked around the cabin, seeing it with new eyes. This place that had once represented her dreams, her future with Thomas, now felt tainted by his betrayal. I don't want to stay here tonight, she decided. Not after this, Flynn nodded. You're welcome at my place for as long as you need. As they rode back to Flynn's ranch, Elizabeth felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. Seeing Thomas again, confronting him, had clarified something important. Her marriage was truly over, had been over long before he physically left. And while that brought sadness, it also brought freedom to imagine a different future. A future that, increasingly, she found herself imagining with Flynn Sullivan. The next morning, Elizabeth woke with a renewed sense of purpose. She would fight for her land, not just because it was hers by right, but because it represented everything she'd worked for, everything she'd sacrificed. Flynn was already in the kitchen when she emerged from the guest room, frying bacon and brewing coffee. The domestic scene touched something deep inside her. "Good morning," he said, smiling when he saw her. "Sleep well, better than I expected," Elizabeth admitted, pouring herself coffee. "I've been thinking about what Thomas said." Flynn flipped the bacon in the pan. "About Harrison?" "Yes. If Thomas is working with Harrison, there must be some record of their arrangement. A letter, a contract, something. You think Thomas might have left evidence at your cabin?" Elizabeth nodded. "He's never been careful with papers. And he clearly didn't expect me to challenge him. He seemed genuinely surprised when we confronted him about the lien." Flynn considered this. "It's worth looking. After breakfast, we'll go back to your place and search." They ate quickly, then rode to Elizabeth's ranch. There was no sign of Thomas, though his belongings were still scattered around the cabin. "He'll be back," Elizabeth said, surveying the mess. "Probably went to report to Harrison." "Then we'd better work fast," Flynn agreed. They searched methodically, starting with the obvious places: drawers, cupboards, Thomas's saddlebags. Elizabeth found nothing of interest until she checked beneath the mattress of their bed. "Flynn," she called, excitement in her voice. "Look at this." She held up a folded document, creased and worn as if it had been carried for some time. Flynn came to her side as she opened it. It was a contract between Thomas Keller and Edward Harrison, dated 2 weeks after Thomas had left the ranch. In it, Thomas agreed to claim a false debt against his property in exchange for $1,000 and 10% of the eventual sale price to the railroad. "This is it," Elizabeth breathed. "Proof of fraud." Flynn read through the document carefully. "This invalidates the lien completely. Harrison created a false debt and Thomas was complicit." Elizabeth felt a surge of triumph. "We need to take this to Sacramento immediately." "Wait," Flynn cautioned. "Harrison and Thomas will realize this is missing. They'll know we have evidence." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying they might try to stop us from using it," Flynn explained. "We need to be careful." As if on cue, they heard horses approaching, several of them, moving fast. Flynn moved to the window, peering out cautiously. "Harrison," he reported grimly. "Thomas is with him and 3 other men." Elizabeth's heart raced. "They know." Flynn quickly assessed their situation. "Back door, we'll take the horses and go through the creek bed. It'll be harder for them to follow." They slipped out the back of the cabin just as Harrison and his men reached the front. Elizabeth could hear Thomas's voice, raised in anger, as they mounted their horses and rode hard for the creek that marked the eastern boundary of her property. The water was low this time of year, the creek bed offering a natural path southward. They rode in silence, listening for sounds of pursuit. "We need to get to the sheriff in Riverside," Flynn said as they emerged from the creek onto higher ground. "Show him this evidence before Harrison can interfere." Elizabeth nodded, her mind racing. The sheriff was generally fair, but he was also cautious about challenging powerful men like Harrison. Would the contract be enough? They had just crested a small rise when gunshots rang out behind them. Flynn cursed, urging his horse faster. "They're gaining on us," Elizabeth called, looking back to see riders in pursuit. "There's a stand of trees ahead," Flynn said. "We'll lose them there." They pushed their horses hard, reaching the tree line just as more shots sounded. Elizabeth felt something hot graze her arm but kept riding, ducking low over her horse's neck. The woods were dense, offering cover but slowing their progress. Flynn led the way, following a game trail that wound through the underbrush. "Are you hit?" he asked, noticing Elizabeth holding her arm. "Just a graze," she assured him. "Keep going." They emerged from the woods onto a familiar track, the road to Riverside. Flynn pulled his horse to a stop, listening. "I don't hear them," he said, "but they'll be coming." Elizabeth pulled the contract from inside her jacket, where she tucked it for safekeeping. "As long as we have this, we have a chance." Flynn nodded, his expression grim but determined. "Let's get to town." They rode hard for Riverside, pushing their tired horses as much as they dared. The small settlement appeared in the distance, its few buildings a welcome sight. The sheriff's office was a modest wooden structure on the main street. Sheriff Miller was sitting outside, enjoying a pipe in the afternoon sun when they galloped up. "Mrs. Keller," he said, rising in surprise. "Mr. Sullivan, what's the rush?" Flynn dismounted quickly, helping Elizabeth down. "We need your help, Sheriff, and we don't have much time." Inside the office, they showed Miller the contract and explained the situation. The sheriff read the document carefully, his weathered face impassive. "This is serious," he said finally. "Fraud, false liens, Harrison's powerful, but this is clear evidence of criminal activity." "Will you help us?" Elizabeth asked. Miller nodded slowly. "I'll need to take this to the county judge, get the lien invalidated officially." "Harrison and his men are right behind us," Flynn warned. "They've already fired shots at us." The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "That's so." He moved to a gun rack, selecting a rifle. "Then I suggest you two stay here while I gather some deputies. If Harrison wants to start a shooting war in my jurisdiction, he'll find I'm well prepared." Relief flooded through Elizabeth. Sheriff Miller was a man of his word, known for his fairness if not his speed. With him on their side, they had a real chance. "Thank you," she said sincerely. Miller nodded, tucking the contract into his vest pocket. "I've never cared for Harrison's methods, been waiting for a chance to check his ambitions." He looked at Elizabeth's arm, noticing the bloodstain on her sleeve. "You're hurt, Mrs. Keller." "It's nothing serious," she assured him. "Nevertheless, you should have Doc Wilson look at it," Miller said. "His office is just down the street. I'll have a deputy escort you." While the sheriff organized his men, a young deputy named Parker walked Elizabeth and Flynn to the doctor's office. Wilson, a kind-faced man in his 60s, cleaned and bandaged Elizabeth's wound efficiently. "You're lucky," he commented. "Another inch to the right and we'd be having a very different conversation." Elizabeth shuddered at the thought. The reality of how dangerous their situation had become was sinking in. Harrison hadn't just tried to steal her land, he'd tried to harm them, possibly even kill them. As they left the doctor's office, they found the street in commotion. Sheriff Miller and 5 deputies had Harrison, Thomas, and their men surrounded in front of the saloon. A crowd of townspeople watched from a safe distance. "It's over, Harrison," Miller was saying as they approached. "I have evidence of your fraud, the lien against Mrs. Keller's property will be invalidated, and you'll face charges." Harrison's face was a mask of controlled fury. "You have nothing but the word of a woman and her lover against respected businessmen." "I have a signed contract," Miller countered, patting his vest pocket. "Between you and Thomas Keller detailing your scheme." Thomas looked pale, his eyes darting between Harrison and the sheriff. "I was forced to sign that," he blurted out. "Harrison threatened me." Harrison turned on him in disbelief. "You spineless fool." Flynn stepped forward, placing himself between Elizabeth and the confrontation. "The truth is out, Harrison. You tried to steal Mrs. Keller's land through fraud, and when that failed, you resorted to violence." "You have no proof we fired any shots," one of Harrison's men argued. Sheriff Miller gestured to Elizabeth's bandaged arm. "Mrs. Keller's wound says otherwise, and I've got 5 witnesses who saw you chasing them with guns drawn." The standoff continued for several tense minutes before Harrison finally raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "This isn't over," he warned, his cold eyes fixed on Elizabeth. "The railroad wants that land. One way or another, they'll get it." "Not through fraud, they won't," Miller said firmly. "Now all of you are coming with me to Sacramento to explain yourselves to the county judge." As the sheriff and his deputies led Harrison and his men away, Thomas hung back, approaching Elizabeth hesitantly. "Lizzie," he began, his voice low and urgent, "you have to believe me. Harrison forced me into this." Elizabeth regarded her husband coldly. "Like he forced you to abandon your home." "Your wife, to chase gold in the north," Thomas had the grace to look ashamed. "I made mistakes, I know that now." "Yes, you did," Elizabeth agreed, "and the biggest one was thinking I would ever trust you again." Flynn placed a supportive hand on her shoulder and she drew strength from his presence. "It's over, Thomas," she continued. "Our marriage, your claims to the ranch, all of it. When this is settled, I'll be filing for divorce." Thomas's face hardened. "Because of him." He jerked his head toward Flynn. "No," Elizabeth said firmly. "Because of you, because you proved beyond any doubt that you don't deserve to be my husband." One of the deputies called for Thomas to move along. He gave Elizabeth one last look, part anger, part regret, before allowing himself to be led away. As the dust settled, the townspeople began to disperse, the excitement over for now. Elizabeth suddenly felt exhausted, the events of the day catching up with her. "Let's get you back to my place," Flynn suggested gently. "You need rest." Elizabeth nodded, too tired to argue. They collected their horses and rode slowly back to Flynn's ranch, neither speaking much along the way. Jake met them at the gate, relief evident on his face. "Heard there was trouble in town," he said. "Everything all right?" Flynn explained briefly as he helped Elizabeth dismount. Her arm throbbed and fatigue made her limbs heavy. Inside, Flynn insisted she sit while he prepared a light meal. The simple domestic task seemed to calm him, and Elizabeth watched, marveling at how natural it felt to be here with him. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked as he set a plate before her. With Harrison, Flynn considered the question. The fraud is exposed, so the lien will be invalidated. But Harrison isn't a man who gives up easily. He'll try another approach. "The railroad still wants my land," Elizabeth acknowledged. "Yes, but now they know Harrison's methods. They might approach you directly, offer a fair price." Flynn sat across from her. "Would you consider selling?" If the offer was right, Elizabeth thought about her ranch, the land she and Thomas had chosen together, the home they'd built. It held memories, both good and painful, but it was still hers. "I don't know," she admitted. "I fought so hard to keep it, but maybe that was more about not letting Thomas and Harrison win than about the land itself." Flynn nodded, understanding in his eyes. "You have options now, time to decide what you really want." What she really wanted. Elizabeth let herself consider the question fully for perhaps the first time. Her gaze settled on Flynn, taking in his kind face, his steady presence. The answer was suddenly, startlingly clear. "I want to be happy," she said simply. "I want a life with purpose, with someone who values me." "Who stays?" Flynn reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Elizabeth," he began, his voice low and earnest, "I know it's soon. I know you're still married, still sorting through all of this, but I want you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here." Elizabeth felt tears welling in her eyes. "Flynn, you don't have to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I just wanted you to know." She turned her hand in his, linking their fingers together. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." They sat like that for a long moment, connected by more than just their joined hands. Then Flynn gently withdrew, rising to clear the plates. "You should rest," he said. "Tomorrow will be another long day." Elizabeth nodded, suddenly feeling the full weight of her exhaustion. She retreated to the guest room, her mind still processing everything that had happened and everything that had been said. As she drifted off to sleep, one thought remained clear. Whatever the future held, she would face it on her own terms, with the strength she discovered within herself. And perhaps when the time was right, with Flynn Sullivan by her side. The next month passed in a whirlwind of legal proceedings and difficult decisions. The county judge invalidated the lien against Elizabeth's property, citing clear evidence of fraud. Harrison and two of his associates were charged with multiple crimes, including fraud, intimidation, and attempted murder for the shots fired at Elizabeth and Flynn. Thomas, in exchange for testimony against Harrison, received a lighter sentence, 6 months in the county jail and a fine. When Elizabeth visited him once in his cell, he seemed diminished somehow, the brash confidence gone from his eyes. "I'm sorry, Lizzie," he said, and for once she believed him. "I never meant for any of this to happen." "I know," she replied, and was surprised to find she no longer felt anger toward him, only a distant sadness for what might have been. "I've filed the divorce papers. Your signature is the last thing needed." Thomas nodded, accepting the inevitable. "What will you do? Keep the ranch?" Elizabeth had given this question much thought over the past weeks. "No," she said, "I'm selling. The railroad has made a fair offer, much better than Harrison's. And Sullivan," Thomas couldn't quite keep the bitterness from his voice. "I suppose he's still in the picture." Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. "Flynn has been a true friend to me, Thomas. More than that, he's shown me what a real partnership looks like, what it means to be valued." Thomas looked away, unable to hold her gaze. "He's a better man than I am," he admitted finally. "I can see that now." "He's the man I need," Elizabeth said simply. "The man I choose." When she left the jail, Flynn was waiting outside with the wagon. He helped her up, his touch gentle and respectful as always. "How did it go?" he asked as they drove away. "Better than expected," Elizabeth replied. "He'll sign the papers," Flynn nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. "And you're still sure about selling the ranch?" "Yes," Elizabeth said confidently. "It's time for a fresh start." The railroad's offer had been generous enough to pay off the small mortgage that legitimately remained on the property and leave Elizabeth with a substantial sum. Freedom, in the form of dollar bills and banknotes. What she would do with that freedom had become increasingly clear over the past weeks. The time spent at Flynn's ranch had shown her what life could be like with a true partner, someone who respected her strength while offering his own in return. They had been careful, maintaining separate rooms, mindful of propriety and Elizabeth's still married status. But the feelings between them had only grown stronger, expressed in small gestures in conversations that lasted late into the night, in the way Flynn always seemed to know when she needed support and when she needed space. The divorce became final on a crisp autumn day, the paperwork arriving by mail with the judge's official seal. Elizabeth sat on Flynn's porch, reading the document that declared her a free woman once more. Flynn found her there, hesitating in the doorway. "Good news?" he asked, seeing the papers in her hand. Elizabeth looked up at him, a smile spreading across her face. "The best news, I'm officially divorced." Something flickered in Flynn's eyes, hope, perhaps, or relief. He came to sit beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "How do you feel?" he asked. Elizabeth considered the question. "Lighter," she decided. "Like I can finally move forward without looking back." Flynn nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And where will you move forward to? Now that the ranch is sold, you have options." It was the opening she'd been waiting for. Elizabeth turned to face him fully. "Flynn Sullivan," she said, her voice clear and steady, "for the past 3 months, you have shown me what it means to be truly cared for. You've respected my independence while offering your strength when I needed it. You've been patient, kind, and unfailingly honest." Flynn's eyes widened slightly as he realized where she was heading. "I love you," Elizabeth continued simply. "And if you'll have me, I'd like to stay, not as your guest, but as your wife." For a moment, Flynn seemed unable to speak, emotion overwhelming him. Then he took her hands in his eyes shining with happiness. "Elizabeth Keller," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "I have loved you since the day I found you standing on your porch with a shotgun. Nothing would make me happier than to have you as my wife." He leaned forward, and their lips met in a kiss that was both gentle and passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. When they finally parted, Flynn pressed his forehead to hers. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I don't want you to feel rushed." Elizabeth smiled, her heart full. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the town church. The entire community turned out, curious to witness the union of the abandoned wife and the steady rancher who'd stood by her through scandal and danger. Elizabeth wore a new blue dress that matched Flynn's eyes, with her mother's lace veil. Flynn looked handsome and nervous in a new suit, his sandy hair neatly combed for the occasion. "I, Flynn Sullivan, take you, Elizabeth, to be my wife," he vowed, his voice strong and clear. "I promise to stand beside you, not in front of you or behind you. To respect your strength while offering mine, to love you faithfully all the days of my life." Elizabeth blinked back tears as she spoke her own vows. "I, Elizabeth, take you, Flynn, to be my husband. I promise to build our life together as true partners. To value your steadfastness and honor your trust, to love you with my whole heart for all our days." As they exchanged rings, Elizabeth felt a sense of rightness, of coming home. This was what marriage should be, a union of equals, built on respect and genuine love. The celebration afterward was joyful, with music and dancing in the town square. Elizabeth noticed Mrs. Johnson from the general store watching them with approval. "I always said you two were meant for each other," the older woman declared when Elizabeth thanked her for the beautiful cake she'd provided. "From the very first time I saw you together, some things are just written in the stars." Later, as they danced beneath the actual stars, Flynn held Elizabeth close. "Happy?" he asked softly. "Completely," she assured him, resting her head against his chest. "And you, more than I ever thought possible," he replied. "I keep thinking of what I said that first day about your husband giving up a jewel for stones." Elizabeth smiled at the memory. "You were right." Flynn kissed her forehead tenderly. "His mistake was my blessing. I'll never take for granted what he threw away." As they swayed to the music, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought them here. Thomas's abandonment, once the most painful experience of her life, now seemed like the first step on a path that led directly to this moment, to this man who valued her as Thomas never had. "What are you thinking?" Flynn asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Elizabeth looked up at him, at the face that had become so dear to her. "That sometimes what feels like an ending is really a beginning in disguise." Flynn smiled, understanding in his eyes, "and this beginning is just the first chapter of a very long story," Elizabeth promised, reaching up to kiss her husband beneath the vast California sky. Epilogue. 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter filled the air as Elizabeth watched her son and daughter playing in the yard. 4-year-old Frank, named for Flynn's brother, was showing his little sister Emma how to feed the chickens without scaring them. "Not too much, Emmy," he instructed with all the seriousness a 4-year-old could muster. "They'll get fat and won't lay eggs." 2-year-old Emma nodded solemnly, her dark curls bouncing. "Fat chickens," she repeated, giggling at the idea. Elizabeth smiled, her hand resting on her swollen belly where their third child grew. The ranch had prospered under Flynn's careful management, expanding to include the land that had once been Elizabeth's. The railroad had built its water tower and small station a mile to the east, bringing new opportunities without disrupting their way of life. Flynn appeared from the barn, crossing the yard with that same purposeful stride that had first caught Elizabeth's attention years ago. His face lit up when he saw her watching him, and he quickened his pace. "You should be resting," he chided gently, coming to stand beside her on the porch. "I am resting," Elizabeth protested, gesturing to the rocking chair she occupied. "Besides, the baby isn't due for another month." Flynn placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch still sending warmth through her after all these years. "Stubborn woman," he said fondly. "You wouldn't have me any other way," she replied, covering his hand with hers. "No," he agreed. "I wouldn't change a single thing about you." They watched their children playing, content in the life they'd built together. It hadn't always been easy ranching, never was, but they had faced every challenge as partners, their bond growing stronger with each passing year. "Letter came today," Flynn mentioned. "From back east." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "Oh, Thomas," Flynn said, his voice neutral. He'd long ago let go of any animosity toward Elizabeth's ex-husband. "He's married again. Says he's settled in Boston, working as a clerk in a shipping office." Elizabeth absorbed this news with mild interest. Thomas was part of a distant past now, a chapter closed long ago. "I hope he's happy," she said sincerely. "Sounds like he might be," Flynn replied. "Says he finally realized what was important, took him long enough." Elizabeth smiled. "Some men learn slower than others," Flynn chuckled, leaning down to kiss the top of her head. "And some women are wise enough to give second chances to the right men." "Only the right ones," Elizabeth agreed, tilting her face up for a proper kiss. As their lips met, Frank's voice called out, "Papa, Emmy's chasing the rooster again." Flynn sighed against Elizabeth's mouth. "Duty calls." "Go," she laughed, shooing him toward the children. "Save the poor rooster." Elizabeth watched as Flynn scooped up their giggling daughter, speaking to her with the perfect mixture of firmness and tenderness that made him such a wonderful father. Frank joined them, tugging on Flynn's pant leg to get his attention. The sight filled Elizabeth's heart to overflowing. This was the life she'd always wanted but hadn't known how to find a true partnership, children born of love, a home built on mutual respect and shared dreams. When Thomas had left her in the dust all those years ago, she'd thought her world was ending. Instead, it had been the beginning of everything that mattered. Flynn looked up, catching her watching them. His smile, still as warm and genuine as the day they met, told her everything she needed to know. She was cherished. She was home. And Flynn Sullivan had been right from the very beginning. She was indeed a jewel, one that deserved to be treasured for exactly what she was.